Before we start this video, we've got some questions for you to think about while you watch the video. Let's see if you can answer them first, but if not, you'll definitely be able to after you've watched the video. So, can you think of what different kind of punishments we have for different crimes now? How do we decide if someone is guilty and deserves a punishment? And why do people commit crimes? Are these answers the same for people throughout history? If not, why not? Think about the difference.
In ancient times, the Romans, who came over here and invaded us, had laws called the 12 Tables, said to have been written in 450 BCE. They were the basic rights for all Roman people and set out the rules on what was allowed. The laws gave answers on what would be your punishment if you committed a crime, like something serious like murder would end in crucifixion, but just stealing something would get you whipped. Since the Romans ruled over so many countries, it was quite difficult to keep control, so they used soldiers. Britain was given a governor who was the man in charge, and then there was a magistrate who would sit in court and hear about the crimes and give out the punishment and make a judgment.
Then we have the Anglo-Saxons, who also used very harsh punishments for criminals. They divided their communities up into groups of 10 men. These 10 men were called tithings, who were responsible for each other's behaviour. If one of them committed a crime, then all of them had to take them to court, or they'd all get punished. Maybe that's a good tactic. I mean, I wouldn't want to get punished for something someone else has done. It was also expected that everyone in the village would help each other. So if you saw a crime being committed, you shouted for help, and everyone who heard was expected to help chase the criminal. They also had similar punishments to before, with whipping or hanging, and the leader of the village used the laws written by the king to decide the punishment. But something new was trial by ordeal. If someone accused of a crime couldn't find enough people to vouch for their innocence, called oath keepers, they instead had to face trial by ordeal, where God would decide if you were guilty or not. But that wasn't exactly reliable. You would have to hold on to a hot iron rod, and if your wounds healed, clearly you were innocent. Most common punishments were fines because there weren't any prisons. But if you committed a crime over and over, like stealing, you might have your hands cut off. They also had something called weregild, which means blood price. If you injured someone, you owe them money. But if you killed someone, you'd pay their relatives.
In Tudor England, one of the most common criminal acts was thieves, because the country was so poor they couldn't afford things like food, so they turned to stealing. And the men in charge decided to bring in even scarier and harsh punishments to try and deter people from committing the crime. But people couldn't afford things, and considering most people lived in the countryside and were farmers, if they had no harvest, they couldn't eat. In smaller towns and villages, control of crimes was largely left up to the community, but some had parish constables in charge of keeping the peace. One particularly harsh punishment was for a vagabond. A vagabond or a vagrant was a person who was too poor and couldn't get a job, so had to move from village to town, and so they were whipped for their crime. Public executions were also common. During Henry VIII's reign, over 70,000 people were executed, including 2 of his wives, but they weren't criminals. They were just unfortunate women trapped in a marriage to a horrible man, but that's a story for another time. The Tudors favoured the very torturous style of punishment for criminals, with the stocks, flogging, and awful inventions like the rack that stretched you out. The stocks were probably the most popular though, because you'd be trapped in between some wood and put in the town centre so people could make fun of you and throw things at you.
In the Victorian era, Britain became very rich and very powerful, with things like trains and cars being invented, which led to more boats, bridges, factories and buildings. This meant that the cities got very busy and very overcrowded, which led to more poverty. There were lots of poor people really struggling, which meant that you could have one family living in one room, sharing an outside toilet with the whole street. Could you imagine having to share your toilet with your neighbours? Ugh! In the Victorian era, the police were created. More specifically, in 1829, in London, Sir Robert Peel started the Metropolitan Police Force. Over the next 10 years, the police were rolled out throughout the country, but they were very poorly paid. More prisons were built, which became the main form of punishment. People were forced to do hard labour inside, and things like the treadmill and the rank were used, which were pointless tasks but it kept you moving all day. A lot of people were sent to Australia for their crimes, which was a new type of punishment called transportation. A lot of people were actually sent there for very minor crimes, and children who had stolen were sent there too. The boat journey to Australia was really long and really tough. It was a horrible punishment. But luckily it ended in 1857. In 1854, reformatory schools were set up to help children who had committed crime, so it meant that children now had different punishment to adults.
During World War II, we had blackouts where everyone turned their lights off to try and avoid bombing raids, and there was rationing which controlled how much food people had, so crime increased quite a lot. After shops were bombed and destroyed, people would steal things from them, so it was really difficult for the police to tell if they had been stolen from or just destroyed through the bombs. Police were also struggling because they had to make sure everyone behaved during the blackouts, they had to control traffic, try and track down these criminals, to help save people from bombs, and to find men who had run away from the army. Since looting and stealing was so common during World War II, lots of fines and prison sentences were given out. But then people just started selling things on the black market, which meant you could buy goods or foods and clothes without a ration card. And if you were caught, you were given more of a fine. There was also, of course, lots of death during World War II, and after an air raid, it was difficult for the police to tell if someone had been murdered or just killed by a bomb. And the criminals sadly took advantage of this, and murder rates rose dramatically.
So that's how crime and punishment changed through time. If you'd like to know more about crime and punishment, then get your grown-up to head over to thelittlehistoriansmagazine.com to read our crime and punishment edition. And if you want to keep up to date with all our videos, make sure you like and subscribe. We'll see you next time!